A voice spoke urgent but quiet, agitating Daedalus out of a deep sleep. In his sunken bed he felt as weighty and cumbersome as a stone talus, but rolled over with all the gelatinous consistency of a woodland choo-choo. Drool poured from his mouth after he settled to his opposite side. His mind, half in another realm, would have fallen back to sleep in an instant if he wasn't then rudely shaken.
Daedalus!
He appeared revived from death. It was a slog for him to peel his crusted eyes open. He then blinked, as if heavily sedated. Impatiently standing above him was his would-be resurrecting angel. She was his baby sister. While Daedalus came to, Kilaria stood there with her arms folded. She looked through him, her lips pursed, almost in a frown. She had an idea. Back and forth her eyes jittered as she formulated and carefully constructed her thoughts, all in the meantime while she waited for him to fully awaken. The idea was simple. Kilaria wanted to see the horse god Melania, but she knew she could not do it alone. She's too young, and frankly, did not yet know how to command a horse. Daedalus did. She had the foresight to know that traveling alone on a lonely trail was too dangerous. This was, of course, to her anyway, an original idea. Much too often, Kilaria held the guidance of her mother in disregard. With such things considered, and contemplated there at the bed once again to be sure, Kilaria decided to commission Daedalus's help in her next adventure. Now then that Daedalus was awake and aware, Kilaria whispered,
I need your help, Daedalus.
One corner of his mouth turned up, and his eyebrow rose too. Cocking his head, his first thought was that of concern.
What happened?
His voice was soft and low, almost that of a whisper. He suspected that either Kilaria was returning from an adventure outside or that she was there to ask him to lie again, just for a while. By now, Daedalus was accustomed to the routine. He found it best to prepare himself for what she was going to say next. He focused on both her eyes and mouth nervously. In the blanket of darkness within Daedalus's room, Kilaria told of her desire to see the horse god. Bouncing her index finger toward the imaginary thought cloud above her, she recollected the mysterious words and tales told out by the creek earlier that day, which was really the yesterday, as it was after midnight. Word by word she built an impressive structure out of sophistry. Every argument she made, every phrase she uttered, Daedalus tilted his head and looked into empty space, trying to unravel the maze of reasons she laid out. But before he ever had time to digest her declarations and persuasions, she would quickly and calculatingly continue on, rambling, it felt like, here and there.
Don't you want to see it, Daedalus?
She said, seeming as though shocked he didn't look excited. Before he could speak for himself, with a hand wave she continued,
I know you want to see it.
Perhaps she did not see the confused look on his face, but it was most likely the case she just did not care. Within moments, she came to the conclusion that all he needed was a little push.
I'm here to help you,
she said.
To help encourage you, duh.
Daedalus lifted his nose, his top lip protruding. He looked befuddled. None of this truly mattered to her anyway. She was going to make it to Melania Spring whether Daedalus came or not, and she made that clear to him.
I don't know,
he said anxiously. As if he hadn't even spoke, she continued her case right over his voice, asserting that she
make it hurt.
She is young, small even, and in her words,
could get kidnapped, or worse.
And both of them knew very well from experience that she could not ride a horse, and would lose control and certainly fall off and get terribly hurt.
Like that one time I fell off near the sacred grove,
she said. Daedalus reluctantly smiled and laughed shallowly through his nose. Feeling like she was losing him, she looked to the side and pulled out another argument from her arsenal she had been gathering together for years now. She knew how much Daedalus feared any kind of separation from his new family, physical or emotional, and his crippling obsession for the love of their mother, Telma. This also extended to the familiar love of Kilaria, though this was retired to the dark recesses of her mind, lest it interfere with her conscience. Because Kilaria would travel up the mountain either way, she asked rhetorically,
This then I ask, and you know the truth already. What kind of brother would you be if you didn't protect me along the way, Besides, what would Mom think?
And there it was, a big gold rupee in the rough. The second nugget of truth protruding from the sophistical structure of words and phrases. She needed protection, and she knew it. Nevertheless, she wouldn't admit it. This was effective, and evoked Daedalus to think about what kind of son he would be if he didn't protect Telma's little girl.
She left you for it.
Kilaria said alluringly.
I'd love you for it.
Her eyes shined in the darkness, seeing her prize nearly within her grasp.
We'd be a family.
And then she jeered, saying,
With a lot of pumpkins.
She made that apparent. Admittedly, the latest fallacious conjectures did increase his attention. His mind was applied to feelings such as anxiety, commiseration, stress, and fear, to note a few. She continued and continued as if she was anticipating a verbal yes from Daedalus, but much to his expense. His eyes grew sore, and his forehead grew lines of apprehension. Lastly, she appealed to his utilitarian nature, and suggested they pray to the horse god for blessings over the farm and the horses therein. To validate her argument, she referenced the mare in the stable, soon to deliver, and how this would ensure a strong and healthy colt.
Mom would appreciate it, and all you did.
She so subtly surmised. Kilaria relied on a suspension of disbelief toward their mother's earlier warnings in order for this to work out in that way.
But, still and all, I'll tell her it was your idea.
Though it seemed like a good thing to say then, to give him credit for a good thing, it did not, in fact, help her case in the ears of Daedalus. When all was said, Daedalus replied quickly,
I'll do it,
raising his hands in submission, in fear that she'd continue to speak. Despite all her excessive double talk, Daedalus was sold on the idea from the moment she told him of the potential danger, and that she could easily be injured. That was enough for him. Daedalus hushed. Click, clack, tap. That was the sound of the stable doors unlatching. The doors announced their presence, and one of the doors sluggishly swung open just above soft soil. The door groaned while the hinges fought its momentum the whole way, creaking to a halt. It sat still. Daedalus's foot sank and squished into mud, stepping over the door's threshold and into the stable. His boots were strong and durable Hylian work boots crafted in a tannery from Hatano village northeast from the woods. His face hid from the moonlight in a crisp shadow under a Hylian hood he wore. Decorative Hylian embellishments followed the hem, which were colored complementary to the hood's reddish-amber hue. This was part of a set that matched his Hylian tunic of the same rustic color. This outfit, he set aside, was for riding. He stepped in, and Kilaria took his place behind him, silhouetted by the sharp moonlight. Two shadows crept their way through the stable, trying to not spook the horses prematurely or for any length of time in order to make their escape without any trouble. To the untrained ear, they sounded like rodents moving about the wet earth, hay flattened like scrunching paper under their boots. The stall door rolled open. Thankfully, but eerily, it barely made a sound. Behind it stood a massive, shadowing creature, taller than if Kilaria were to stand on Daedalus's shoulders. A cloud of steamy breath shot out of its nostrils, lit by the stall window behind it, along with a low rumble spurred growl. When the beast became aware of their presence, it became agitated and shuffled its front hooves against the ground. Feeling each stomp of the beast under her own feet, Kilaria stepped back and raised her arms preemptively. At the same time, Daedalus stepped forward with grace, hands stretched out. Gently and intimately, she watched as Daedalus ran his finger down the beast's forehead to its muzzle. He stood, even onto his toes, arms stretched forth. By petting the beast in such a calming way, he subdued it to lower its head to his level. The head of the draft horse was nearly as big as the boy, limbs and all. Growing closer, its muzzle rested near Daedalus's nose. He continued to quiet the beast until the stallion was fully at peace, breathing together as one.
You're a good boy,
he said, drawn out with a long exhale. At the same time Daedalus began to soothe the stallion, the mare across the stable was then too nickering. Kilaria quickly made her way over and attempted to do the same as Daedalus. Growing up on the farm, she had quieted the horses a few times before, but still, she peeked over her shoulder to mimic what Daedalus had done. She looked furtively over her shoulder with just her eyes, acting in secret, like she was betraying her self-esteem in some way. Even with the visual aid, it took her considerably longer to calm the mare. Daedalus had an affinity with animals in a way she did not understand. There was even a time he was able to hypnotize several animals to follow him in a kind of march, with just a melody from an ocarina he had.
Amazing,
she covetously thought to herself. While Kilaria stilled the mother horse, she examined her, looking along the mare's side to see her girth. She was nearly due. Horses tend to give birth in the early hours of the morning and require a small paddock to ensure the foal can walk and move properly. This meant that because the mare could have gone into labor any day then, Telma would have likely woke up early to check up on and tend to the mare. This horse was soon to foal, yes, but Kilaria thought they'd be back before the mare's foaling. They were sure of it. By the time Kilaria had finished calming the mare, Daedalus had already saddled the bulky and large beast and was ready to ride. The horse was hulking in musculature, his neck was larger than both the kids combined, and his chest higher than the tip-top of Kilaria's head. The hair of the beast was dark as night, but when hit by the light it showed hints of brown, creating a silky ash-brown coat with frost-tipped hooves. Daedalus dropped down, splashing mud. He heaved Kilaria over him to help her reach the saddle. Even then, she had to climb and crawl her way to the topside of the seat. It was large enough to fit both the children comfortably. She ran her fingers through the stallion's white mane and held firm. It electrifyingly shined to her touch. Daedalus next hoisted himself up, just after having to leap, necessarily, to reach the saddle horn above the pommel. He adjusted himself into his seat, and examined the horse to make sure the beast was fitted correctly, and that he was comfortable underneath the children. When he took hold of the reins, his arms wrapped around Kilaria and embraced her fragile childish figure. It was warm, she thought. She glanced over her shoulders and took notice of his encompassing hold, and blushed. It was oddly cozy and felt safe. To her surprise, she liked it. Just as quick as a kick and a shout, the horse jolted forward. Kilaria flung back into Daedalus's chest. The sudden shock from delightful comfort to violent speed frightened her. But once adjusted, she laughed. They rode swiftly into the night, leaving the village behind. Sitting upon a rock beneath a tree and among the various woodland foliage was a small lizard, about the size of a Hylian's forearm. Its forked tongue flicked in and out, tasting the air. The reptile was similar in shape and appearance to a lizalfo, however, with a dumb and harmless look about it. Its eyes pointed every which opposite way, while its head jerked and froze in seemingly arbitrary fashion. True, it had no sword to bear, and wouldn't appear to have the agility to stand upright, but perhaps there was a time it was supernaturally enlarged with great strength and intelligence via evil magic and control to fight alongside the forces of darkness. Howbeit, there was no way to truly tell. Suddenly, the earth began to rumble beneath the rock where it was perched. Its tongue again poked and prodded the air, dumbfounded at the most alarming shaking. The thunderous sound grew closer at frightening speed. Out of the blackness, a beast with 2 riders came crashing through the brush, snapping thick branches, causing the lizard to pop up into the air, with the shock stiffening its limbs. Its legs stretched out in all 4 directions. It appeared to fly. There was a gust of turbulent draft in the beast's wake that pushed the lizard through the air. Before it landed, its legs frantically began flailing until it struck the ground and darted off into the nearby vegetation. Daedalus and Kilaria rode deep into the labyrinth of trees where there was naught but a trail to guide them. There lay only narrow pathways, beaten down by foot, that merchants use often to travel the forest shrouded in dense canopy. In the cloak of leafage and umbrage, the children secretly slipped past villages as the people there slept soundly. Only a sound of low rumbling in the distance made it to the villages. Even from a clearing, looking in, small rays of moonlight breaking through the leaves was all that could be seen. All that was shown were illuminated dots of revealing light upon the kids' blurring fast contours. Eventually, through a persistent gallop, the trees opened up. Where once clusters of trees blocked their view beyond a short distance, there was now just a tree here and there along their route. To the horse's delight, the foliage and shrubbery sat no taller than his knees, making for a more comfortable stride. He nickered with pleasure, almost imitating an arrogant laugh. Furthermore, soon after that, the soil grew softer and softer, but was to become dry and even harder yet after the swamps. So as they went on, the ground turned swampy for the worse, and the large hooves of the stallion sunk with each step, pulling muck and gunk out from underneath the earth. Sometimes it flung all the way up, landing on Kilaria and her brother.
Yuck.
She said in disgust, wiping mud from her upper lip. She could taste it. Kilaria's eyes opened wide, and a smile grew with an increasing drip of excitement. She began looking around, taking in as much of the landscape as possible. She leaned her chin around and over Daedalus's arm that nuzzled her in the seat against him. The horse's gait was so long and high that she placed her hand on her brother's limb in an attempt to stop her chin from bouncing off his restraining arm as the ride jounced and shook. She could see there was a shallow lake that rested here in the swamp. With any luck, she would catch a glimpse of a real live Enox. She stared into the cold, lifeless swamplands. Nothing moved under the light of the moon. Not a creature was stirring. death and decay rose up from the murky pools of bog water and pillars of gas every other pool far and wide. Daedalus knew the location where they rode through. He tightened his snug hold on Kilaria. She pouted her lip, contorted her face, and snapped her head back to him, angry like a small child would be. If there was an Enox nearby, he would expect large boulders to be flung in their direction. This was the creature's main offensive strategy. On the bright side, they were sluggish, lazy, and liked to sleep for long periods of time unless disturbed. Daedalus was aware of these dangers. He even knew of the decline in Enoch sightings since the Wind Sorcerer was sealed into the four-sword blade many years ago. Nonetheless, unnoticed by Kilaria, Daedalus worried for her safety at all times. It wasn't long after passing near to Heron Lake that the soil dried up. The kids were finally nearing the Hylia region. Still, this was a long way south of Lake Hylia, in which Kilaria had never been and always wanted to. That adventure would have to wait, she compromised. The dry Faron grasslands were virtually upon the two of them, just over the Rusty Mountains. This made clear that they had arrived. The great beast was reined in at the bridle and slid to a halt, his massive momentum scarring the earth. Exhausted, tired, and sore, they sat there upon the horse, gazing high up, their heads fully knocked back and their necks stretched long. And they marveled at the ridge of a mountain peak that was once hardly visible over the trees where they lived. Low drifting and gloomy clouds blew gently past the mountain's crest. A dark low hum rose in the pits of their stomach. Perchance it was distant thunder rumblings creeping along the dense rocky landscape from the grasslands. Nevertheless, at last, there it was, Horse God Mountain. What before seemed so far away now stood ominously over the two children. Ibarra Butte is the south arm of the mountain that encircled Melania Spring. Geographically, the mountain resembled a horseshoe, with its curve facing the east. Its entirety was connected with various rising buttes and pillars of rock that protected the spring and hid it deep within the arid umbra. It's a secret to everybody, and it's dangerous to go alone. On the west end of the horseshoe-like terrain, the mountain opened up to a bridge. It was wooden, feebly built, and swayed back and forth, moved by every subtle influence. Supporting the bridge's structure were various planks of wood that were haphazardly and arbitrarily nailed onto its legs. The whole thing looked apparently as though someone long ago reinforced the bridge where it seemed weak in order to correct the areas that looked like no thought or foresight was used originally when it was built. Would it support their weight? It was difficult to tell. Beneath Horse God Bridge was a knee-wobbling drop. It was a long way down. A gulch held a small lake below, separated by a small hump of land in the center, acting as some sort of dam in the dry season. The water was murky and blacker than the center of a dark choo-choo blob. Sinister-looking plants protruded above the surface. Some looked like they drifted through the mirrored water if you stared long enough. Some of them trembled and shook sporadically, sending ripples through the blackened water until the shrubs disappeared under the sliding cover of mist.
Are you okay?
Daedalus said gently, but with a strong stewarding tone. The inflection in his final syllable expressed worry. Kilaria turned her head around, but eyes locked to the cavernous drop in front of them.
Yeah.
She whispered, peeling her gaze from what lies ahead. Her voice trembled just barely enough to catch it. Daedalus curled his lip inward and exhaled, keeping his concern a secret. The children and their steed had raced up the westward trail that climbed up the steep mountain. The incline was so great, in fact, that at times, both Kilaria and Daedalus had to hug close to the horse's back to avoid falling off. The trail then turned east, continuing the ascent. The mountain was so perilous that even small boulders, but bigger than Kilaria, fell down in their path. The earth here was continually stirring, as if it was uncomfortable in its lithospheric skin. The trail led them to the bridge. Holding the reins tight, Daedalus held Kilaria firm between his arms and felt her shiver once. She breathed and shook again. Her hands were wrung raw against the saddle's pommel. Turning inside out, her stomach protested on the edge of such a death trap. With a growing sickness inside her, she grew distraught, looking through her memories to find the courage and brave boldness she conjured in her previous adventures that now she so tragically had forgotten. Where was the girl she knew from The Adventure of Kilaria? The air deflated out of her as she ruminated on the time during the week she made a wooden mask, hand-painted it to look like the mythical ancient stories, and commanded the magic of Majora's Mask. She leered at the bridge, and it peered back, sending a nauseating shiver down her spine. The brevity of her courage became apparent, and the pride in her make-believe heroic tribulations melted into a puddle of queasy modesty.
There's no reason to do this.
She made the case to herself.
Daddy wouldn't. He'd want me to stay on the side.
Now, this journey she had taken, she might call it a link to the past, simply because of the connection the bridge made in her tragic memories. Even though she had to prove to her mother that she was brave enough to lay sight upon the horse god, the bridge ultimately scared her far too much. Too stubborn to admit her failure out loud to Daedalus, she remained silent, hopelessly waiting for him to announce they were headed back. She relied on him to declare that it was too dangerous. So she sat, in agonizing and crippling fear, eyes clamped shut, waiting for salvation in his voice. Now, Daedalus desperately wanted to turn back, but knew, based on what he'd gathered about Kilaria over the years, if he made the plea, she would become even more emboldened to proceed. He waited what felt like an eternity for her to say something, anything at all. He stared at the back of her head, waiting. She trembled inside, hesitating just the same. Her blonde hair shimmered under the moon. Alas, she said nothing. She only sat in silence, presumably waiting for the horse to move forward. And so, Daedalus did just that. As the beast slowly gated along the bridge, its hooves clacked loudly one at a time. Dust and dirt was shaken loose under each step and rained all the way down to the water below. The boards flexed under the weight of the great horse and groaned. They crackled before settling back into shape. The kids were halfway across the bridge now. Somehow, the second half seemed so much longer than the first. A long, creaking sound echoed through the bridge, followed by a small popping jolt. The bridge buckled slightly under the weight, surely a heaviness it had not seen for many years. No, decades. Its age had truly weakened it. Through all of these noises and sensations, Kilaria gripped tightly to the horse's mane. Her sweaty hands clenched so tight that the horse shook its head in irritation and whinnied. No different than if diving without a gifted Zora scale, Kilaria held her breath so tight her cheeks were about to pop and her eyes were clamped shut. Her face was turning red. She did not like bridges. They seemed so foreboding. It was the gravity of it all. The way she saw it. If we were meant to be off the ground, we'd be like the Rito and have wings. Or perhaps we'd have rocky exteriors like the Gorons to protect us when we fall. It would have comforted her to be able to curl up and resemble a boulder and tumble safely down the mountainside. However, the reality of it was that Hylians were more akin to gooey choo-choos than anything else, she thought. They'd splat like them, too. Before Kilaria could finish her fear-induced miserere, the horse stood still in its place. She peeled her eyes open to see that they had made it across, safe and sound. Nevertheless, she still shivered with a shallow tremble. The crippling and petrifying anxiety that the passing over produced stayed with her beyond the dangerous and perilous crossing. She struggled to get control of herself, but was glad the ordeal was over. A long and very tall stone corridor laid before them. Soft grass and scattered bush met the feet of the natural walls on either side. In the center was a trail beaten down by the foot of travelers, that curved to the left, obscuring what waited ahead. Now safely on solid ground, the children moved closer. Daedalus's eyes keyed in on several points in the shadows, high and low, looking for danger wherever and however it may appear. Kilaria was just happy to be over the bridge. The cold stone precipice above overhanged and closed in on the children with a stalking demeanor. Daedalus took note of the way the limestone walls angled and snaked, blocking the view forward. It gave off an impression of purposeful seclusion. The deeper into the corridor the children went, the darker it became. To their surprise, the blackest shadows previously along their journey were not absolute. No, now their eyes could not even peer into the nooks in the passageway that were hidden from the moonlight. The horse trotted deeper into the belly of the encompassing mountain. That's when she saw it. It was a soft, gentle, pulsating glow coming from further within the high canyon. The light was warm, kind, and inviting. Allowing for such needed comfort, the light flirted with a soliciting diversity to the harsh blackness of night around them. It drew their focus much like flies to an organic bug-eating plant. Kilaria's eyes sparkled. They grew large, hypnotized by the glow. She wondered what lay beyond the bend. All else faded away from view. Only the light held her focus. Then the horse slammed its foot into the ground, stopping its trot unmarked. She fell forward and staggered over the beast's neck.
Hey!
Kilaria said, disgruntled, just after being snapped out of her induced haze. When she turned to give Daedalus a piece of her mind, she noticed his head turned full stop to their rear. He was focused on the bridge.
Kilaria, we have a problem.
She heard what he said, but did not comprehend the implicated severity in his tone.
What?
She replied, confused. He remained still as a stone, like a possum stiff before a predator. With her right arm, she held onto his left, pulling herself over to catch a clear view of the bridge behind them. Standing on the ground, covered in solid black shadow, her eyes saw a figure, also solid black, cut out against the moonlit background which was painted a desaturated and dim greenish blue. The man stood there, just as unflinching as Daedalus. Though Daedalus could not see the man's eyes, their eyes were assuredly locked to each other, all the same. She looked back and forth, to Daedalus, then to the stranger in the distance, concerned about who would move first. The moonlight glinted on an object in the figure's hand as he twisted it slowly, almost like he was fidgeting with it. It was a blade, crescent in shape and vicious looking. Kilaria's eyes snapped to Daedalus, and her lips parted. Alarmed, she looked up to him to see what he was going to do, and she hoped sooner than later because the situation made her anxious and filled with worry. Time must have slowed, because Daedalus was still frozen, watching, waiting. His eyes had not wavered, not for a second.
What's he thinking about?
She desperately wondered. She wanted him to act. After a long, staring game of Kuko, the silence was abruptly split by a zipping whistle that sliced the air. 2 arrows pierced the horse's side. One cut through Daedalus' leg, leaving an open gash. The beast screamed and reared up, kicking violently. Daedalus winced in pain, but was too focused on holding Kilaria down against the saddle to notice his wound. The sudden rise almost threw both kids over the back end. Quickly, the horse jounced and darted forward at breakneck speed, attempting to flee the stabbing pain. A duplex bow had released 2 arrows from the ridge above. It fires 2 arrows at once to ensure the archer's target comes to a swift and none-too-pleasant halt. Kilaria grappled the horse tight by its mane in fear for her life. Daedalus struggled to keep himself on top while anchoring Kilaria against the saddle. She winced and shriveled up in terror. Coming around the bend at blinding speed, the children saw the source of the glow. In an alcove, a spring lay tucked deep inside the horseshoe-shaped mountain. Arching over the spring was a crown of lightly colored stone that resembled sulfur or bone in texture and hue. Under the penumbra of the rocky crown was a large plant ovary resembling a kawano fruit, picked so fresh its red stem was still attached. The fruit sat on a small island in the center of the spring. Leading away from the plant was a thin isthmus that connected the island and the other side of the pool of water, forming a teardrop-shaped peninsula. The source of the glow was a troop of magical mushrooms below the Gigantocorpus. They pulsated, surging a warm and vibrant orange. Kilaria's eyes softened and her body quieted as the mystical glow was captured in her eyes. Daedalus, however, was not so blessed to be tranquilized. His heart filled with dread, looking toward the end of the corridor that would, in moments, seal their doom. Before Kilaria could soak it all in, they heard yet another dual whistle resonate through the air above. Several actions dominoed all at once. The 2 arrows hit their mark, penetrating the heart of the beast. The animal came crashing down with a loud thud, and the children were catapulted over the beast's head, where they too slammed against the ground before rolling and sliding to a grinding and bloody halt. While in the air, Daedalus had just enough time to pull Kilaria into himself and rotated so that she landed on him. After that, Kilaria was violently thrown from his arms in the chaotic contact with the earth. They both rolled, separated, and settled on the rocky ground, where the trail made it bare. Dust rose and carried on the wind in the aftermath. Daedalus lifted his head to an obscured form of the horse's contour through the smoke, it kicking and whining while sprawled against the ground. While nickering toward emptiness, the animal slowly began losing the strength to kick. On Daedalus's other side, he could hear cries from Kilaria. With a single arm, he pulled himself, crawling toward her shadow in the dust, in absolute horror of it all. When Daedalus finally crawled to Kilaria, he reached for her ankle, if only to touch her so she'd know he was there. Then a shadowy man approached the children from within the dust cloud. Kilaria ceased to cry when she felt Daedalus hold her. She likened it to Nehru's love, and felt protected when he lifted himself up and wrapped his arms around her bruised body. Now there were 2 men, and now a 3rd shadow leaped from high above, down into the cloud, landing as quiet as a feather. The man from the bridge boldly walked toward the kids. The closer he came, the clearer his appearance. This one, the one with the vicious sickle, orchestrated the attack. Moving closer yet, the man exhaled as if bored and unchallenged, removed his oval mask, and held it limp below his side as he swaggered. When he passed the dying animal, he lifted his sickle toward its satchels, without breaking eye contact with Daedalus, and commanded his clansmen, "Check for bananas." That was when the mask he wore came into view under clouded and dusty moonlight. The wood was badly damaged, the paint scraped and scarred, but it looked like the symbol of the Sheikah tribe, Daedalus concluded. But he refused to believe the Sheikah would defile their name by attacking travelers. He couldn't understand why they wore a torn cloth bearing the eye symbol upside down. His traditionally blue stealth tights were stained red with what seemed to be blood. But they were the original tights. He could see where the fabric was once blue. The man cocked his head to the side, the moonlight catching his eye. It shined red. The attacker looked amused by Daedalus's interest in his outfit. The bandit cheekily flaunted himself by lifting his arms outward a little. While one of the thieves pillaged the satchel on the nearly dead beast, the animal drew its last breath and relaxed limp. There was a change in the wind for a moment, then all fell silent. The air was so still that when the thief rummaging at the horse lifted his head, bemused, Daedalus heard his facial rings and piercings clinging against the inside of his mask. The bandit froze. The leader turned when he heard what he should not have heard so well, and the gravel under his foot crunched so loud they all could hear each pebble shifting. The silence was painfully deafening. Without warning, a loud cry shook the earth and rent the mountain walls in two. A ghastly yell of absolute ferocity boiled over the spring. Both the children and the bandits were helpless to brace themselves and look to the source of the earth's shattering noise. Seeping from the depths of the pool was a powerful and unyielding shadow. As it rose, a blood-curdling, long-winded reverse growl of dissent and wrathfulness reverberated like an inhale of infirmity. As if writhing in agonizing suffering, the ground continued to rumble. Reaching the height of the ghostly shadow's ascent, things that looked like metaphysical arms attached to gruesome claws snapped outward from its body with a loud crack. Then, after that display of terror, a head began to form. The head lifted on the hinge of what would be the spirit's neck, chin first, from behind, and snapped into place. Clicking and cracking, the malevolent spirit's head twitched and ticked sporadically. Kilaria thought it looked like a demonically possessed beast irritated by flies relentlessly biting at its ears. The head resembled that of a horse, howbeit had the appearance of, or possibly wore as a cover, a roughly carved ritual mask with head dressings. Though everyone was frozen in fear, they all gasped and exclaimed in awe at every movement the creature made as it towered above them. Ultimately, the dark godlike creature lagged once, settled as if hovering, and then swayed for a moment. Everyone fell spine-chillingly silent. Kilaria still had streams of tears down each side of her face, nose red, eyes sore, and still suffering from hyper-double breathing. Madly astonished, her lips parted and she thought,
Is this the horse god Malenia?
Involuntarily, Kilaria whimpered aloud from residual effects of crying lungs. The great fairy swooped down directly toward the source of her sorrowful sounds. Daedalus threw his hands over her mouth and held them both as still as he could. Her hair danced from the rush of air produced by the massive size and motion of Melania. Even the red shadow folk feared to move. Melania, inches away from Kilaria's face, peered into her soul. His head twitched and cracked crooked, producing the sound of popping bones while he studied and judged her. Gruesomely gazing inside the eye holes of the ritualistic head dressing, she saw cold, dark emptiness that felt as though it had drawn on infinitely. Kilaria looked behind the emptiness, further than she had ever seen before. In the blackness, she had a spectral vision. She saw the way a blind man sees. For a fleeting moment, she felt the wind on her face, smelt fields of green grass, heard thunderous rushing streams of fresh water, and smelt the crisp, cold odor thereof, and experienced power like that of a beast. Melania huffed grisly and lifted away from Kilaria. She, as if broken out of chains or set free from some hypnotic voodoo, fell into Daedalus's chest, tugged his tunic toward her, and cried as if she lost something integral. She later would compare it to something akin to losing a limb in battle and left excruciatingly vulnerable, forever handicapped and never whole again. Melania then gracefully, but with great power, swung his large mass over the bandits. Amid his hover, the charms and beads of the headdressing rattled and clacked along with his tapping bones. Then, only once each, above the men and children, he swooped left and kicked crooked, then swooped right, and his bones cracked. Air swooshed and blew with great wind. Finally, to everyone's alarm, Melania's revealing and searching eyes locked with the snapping of his head to the lifeless horse. He saw that it was dead, slain by the hands of men. The air now stood still, as it did before. Disrupting the quietness, the fairy's head began to rattle to a crescendo. He popped his back straight with a violent thrust, threw his clawed hands out, and shouted louder than before. Both the men and children interpreted the sound to be that of a great grief and mourning. Having some sense scared into them, the bandits started stepping backward, shaking off the fear that held them like molasses. Melania sunk down into the spring and roared from below the earth, shaking it until rocks began to fall from above. Boulders broke free from the mountain's corridor walls with decisive aim. One of the three bandits was crushed by the first large boulder, about a meter in size. He popped like a red choo-choo, splashing red goo all over Kilaria and Daedalus. To their terrific disgust, the chunks contained heart pieces. Daedalus picked himself up and covered Kilaria with his body, instructing her to cover her head. By now, the bandits made for the bridge. Rocks as large as fists came crashing down on Daedalus while he protected Kilaria, but that was a blessing compared to what happened to the men. At the same time, a blood-chilling scream came from the second red Sheikah as another ton rock flew at an unnatural angle onto him, exploding his skull to globs before his legs were launched upward behind him. Looking at the chaos, the kids were tormented, but otherwise left spared from the largest of the falling boulders, which surely would have meant certain death. Daedalus was still, however, pummeled by falling rocks large enough to bruise severely. Kilaria saw all that Daedalus had done for her, and seeing that she was relatively unharmed, and how he protected her, she conceded to herself.
You're not so bad, really.
After confessing her secret, just loud enough for herself to hear, that was when the leader of the small band of thieves was crushed. He twitched once and died. That was the moment the attack ceased, and everything stood hushed. Daedalus knew this was their chance. He climbed to his feet and lifted Kilaria by her arm and said,
Let's go.
When the kids reached the bridge, something peculiar happened. A shadow resembling Melania slid across the ground as some sort of supernatural projection toward the horse that lay dead. Before, the fairy's cries and shouts were loud and terrible. Now they were subtle and deep, sorrowful wails of mourning that reverberated through the canyon to the sound much like bending iron groaning under a terrible weight. The shadow dissipated, and water boiled over the spring. Flowing water overtook and submerged the body of the horse, and the pool turned into an endless fountain. The dead horse was baptized in the waning magic of the spring water. The spring flowed over the cliff where the bridge connected. Closely, both of them watched in anticipation.
If Melania was once as powerful as the stories foretold,
He said, and they wondered in vain. Both of them thought perhaps the beast would rise anew and fertile. The stream stopped, and the last of the water fell into the blackness below, and the carcass of the beast was gone.
but I think his power has weakened a great deal.
He sadly concluded, thus ending their contemplating thoughts. The two never looked back. But Kilaria had a resilient optimism of it all yet. She, herself, could not place it, but the inclination she felt might have been something she saw in the blind darkness of Melania's eye.